Europe was left stunned when Gabon suddenly terminated its 18-year fishing agreement with the European Union, without warning, without a gradual phase-out. For nearly 2 decades, European ships had harvested Gabon's marine resources, while pledges of development quietly faded into the background. So, why did Gabon make this bold move? And what are the implications? Let's dive in. Gabon and the European Union signed what many referred to as a modern fisheries partnership agreement in 2007. At first look, the agreement seemed like a wise choice for a coastal country with a richness of marine resources, but little ability to use them. European vessels were permitted to gather tuna and other commercial species in Gabonese waters in exchange for the EU paying Gabon to grant access to its exclusive fishing zones. The funds were purportedly intended to support the growth of Gabon's indigenous fishing sector. In theory, the deal included all the necessary components for a just transaction: income for Gabon, seafood for Europe, and the possibility of expanding a developing country's capabilities. However, the way it transpired over the course of 18 years presents a totally different picture, one of rising imbalance, low responsibility, and stealthy extraction. Numerous European trawlers, mostly from France and Spain, were permitted to operate in Gabon's abundant marine domain thanks to the arrangement. However, these ships did more than fish. They were dominant. Outfitted with sophisticated sonar, refrigeration, and industrial hauling systems, they searched the seas more effectively than any Gabonese effort. Local fishermen were forced to compete with floating factories that could remove anything from the sea in a matter of hours. However, the main problem wasn't what was taken, but rather what never made it on shore. The EU boats were not required to land their catch in Gabonese ports under the provisions of the agreement. The fish left Gabon completely and traveled directly from the net to processing facilities in Europe. As a result, there were no local jobs in packaging, freezing, cleaning, or shipping. Only offshore profit and onshore promises, no training, no storage, and no investment in the cold chain mechanisms that could have established a true domestic fish business. Although this practice was technically permitted by the agreement, it was a deeper failure because there was no strong developmental clause. Although Gabon had opened its borders, it did not insist that the money flow through its economy. Without infrastructure, specialized labor, or a voice in the management of its marine resources, the nation turned into a resource supplier, and it became more difficult to deny that reality as the years went by. In comparison to the estimated worth of the fish taken away, Gabon's yearly reimbursement of almost 1.6 million euros was a pittance. According to experts, the EU fleets harvest tuna and similar species worth tens of millions of dollars annually. Gabon was essentially renting its natural resources for a little portion of their value, with the hope that development would come eventually. The disparity was systemic rather than merely financial. The government of Gabon lacked a sophisticated surveillance system to completely confirm the amount being removed. They used information from the actual fleets conducting the fishing, in part. There was little enforcement and growing worries about bycatch and underreporting. To put it briefly, Gabon transferred access, but not authority. Payments were made to it, but no power. Additionally, Gabon's coastal population remained stranded while the European vessels moved quickly and covertly. Fishermen in Libreville's Port Gentil expressed dissatisfaction over declining zones and stocks. There weren't many jobs in the fishing industry for young people. Between ambition and desertion, the country's dream of developing a fish-based economy remained on hold. The fact that this story was so unnoticed hurts even more. In contrast to lumber or oil, which frequently attract worldwide attention, the topic of sea access is typically quiet. No protests, no headlines, only far-off ships on a far-off horizon taking. But resentment increased with time. The deal was dubbed a legalized siphon by political analysts. A change was also taking place behind the scenes. The unpleasant issues began to be asked by a new generation of Gabonese policymakers, including some close to Brice Oligui Nguema. Where is the progress if this is a partnership? Why do we continue to observe from the shore if this is cooperation? The EU's strategy was not the only thing called into question by those inquiries. They questioned Gabon's ability to safeguard its riches, and if the country was prepared to keep acting as a resource giver in a system that provided no tangible benefits. That's the start of the break. With a developing understanding that being passive in the name of collaboration is just another way to be taken advantage of, rather than with a political speech. Now that the contract is gone, Gabon has to make a decision. However, it must first address what it lost and what it gave away too cheaply before creating anything new. Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comments section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's proceed. When Brice Oligui Nguema took over as Gabon's interim president in 2023, the nation was already overrun with contracts that appeared promising on paper but provided little in reality. A tradition of courteous plunder and diplomatic diplomacy was passed down to him. A country that is abundant in minerals, oil, forests, and marine life, but is constantly watching its wealth disappear as it waits for progress that never materializes. Although it was only one example, the EU fishing deal ended up being the most emblematic. It took a revolution for Nguema to realize what was wrong. All he had to do was listen. Gabonese labor, coastal communities, and industry observers, not foreign consultants, had grown weary of seeing European ships glide silently across their horizon, taking resources like clockwork, leaving hardly any trace. This wasn't merely a policy failure, in his opinion. It was an affront to philosophy. The notion that in order for a sovereign country to be deemed developed, it must lease out its natural wealth. Thus, he opted for conflict rather than obedience. However, it wasn't a snap choice. It was purposeful, methodical, and deeply symbolic. There was more to Nguema's decision to leave the EU fisheries deal than just fish. The shift toward economic self-respect was evident. It served as a warning that Gabon would no longer tolerate agreements that deprive it of its autonomy. No matter how well prepared the documents were or how tactfully they were presented, they had no place in Gabon's future if the benefit did not remain inside its boundaries. This method is based on a single radical premise and is now commonly referred to as the Nguema doctrine within his group. Development must come after control. Wealth that you do not control cannot be used to establish a powerful nation. Whether the resource is tuna or oil is irrelevant. No matter how much money comes in, there will always be dependency if the state doesn't control its flow, manage its value chain, and direct its course. This doctrine's potency stemmed from both its timing and clarity. The world was changing. Supply chains around the world were being reassessed. Africa was now viewed as a vital region for upcoming economic competitiveness rather than as a backwater of extraction. Nguema saw this as a limited opportunity to reshape Gabon's connection with the outside world. His government then started reviewing all current investment, trade, and extraction agreements with a focus on justice rather than legality. Was Gabon benefiting from the deal? Did it create jobs? Was knowledge being outsourced while importing dependencies, or was internal expertise being created? The fishing pact was a complete failure. Importantly, Nguema had nothing against international collaborations, but he disapproved of those that internalized poverty and externalized wealth. According to his revised plan, infrastructural development, domestic employment, and local processing would be necessary for any future access to Gabon's natural resources, including its waterways. No more invisible economies being fueled by ghost fleets or fly-in, fly-out businesses. According to reports, Nguema described the EU fisheries agreement in private meetings as a rope around the ankle, which resembled a handshake but served as a leash. Its termination was intended to shock the system, compel renegotiation, and above all, teach Gabon to assert its ground in rooms where it had previously been instructed to sit quietly. It was not merely an economic reset. Furthermore, the word spread beyond Brussels. Mauritania, Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, and other African nations, particularly those on the western coast, were observing. Similar fisheries agreements with the EU were in place for many. Many expressed similar annoyances with declining stocks, unclear domestic development, and a lack of transparency. By making its unilateral and unreserved withdrawal, Gabon was not only protecting its interests, but also undermining a whole paradigm of global economic cooperation. Since then, Nguema's philosophy has been applied to numerous fields. Gabon started to impose stricter rules on the export of raw timber in the forestry sector, requiring on-site processing. Reviews of previous concessions were started in the mining industry. Even contracts for oil, which were formerly considered sacred, are being examined with new eyes. This is the one thing that Nguema is trying to make apparent. The sale of Gabon is no longer unconditional. He has drawn praise and criticism for this stance. He has been charged by several Western analysts with populism and deterring investors. However, a growing number of local business owners and many Africans have a different perspective. A leader who is prepared to lose favor elsewhere in order to stay at home. His abstinence from fishing wasn't a publicity gimmick. It was the initial test of a concept with broad ramifications. What occurs if an African leader ultimately rejects a business model rather than a single deal? Over time, the solution will become clear. For Gabon, however, it starts right now. With clear waters, complete sovereignty, and a future that will be molded according to its wishes for the first time in many years. However, keep in mind that Brice Oligui Nguema's audacious decision to leave the EU fisheries agreement wasn't made overnight. Years of witnessing something subtly vanish gave rise to it. Not only the fish, but also the potential revenue that could have been generated if Gabon had retained even a small portion of the exports. The true loss was this: economic, industrial, and human in addition to ecological. And most people didn't notice it for 18 years. Thus, it didn't appear to be a catastrophe. It appeared to be nothing. That is how undetectable erosion can be dangerous. When no industry develops behind the obvious theft of resources, no supply chains, no training programs, no processing plant smoke, just quiet. That's what happened in the fishing industry in Gabon. This industry has enormous potential, but it lacks infrastructure, a pipeline for workers, and a national stake in the billions of dollars worth of marine products that travel through its seas. Foreign ships were permitted to fish free and go without docking according to the agreement with the EU, and they did precisely that. After being processed in Spain or France, where jobs, packaging, tax income, and added value were all kept, the captured fish were promptly exported. Gabon lost more than simply fish. It lost a whole ecosystem of economic opportunity that could have given its citizens more influence and reshaped its coastal cities. Consider this. Local cold chains would have needed to be constructed if the fish had been landed at Libreville or Port Gentil. Training in sorting, filleting, freezing, and packaging might have been provided to Gabonese employees. Regional fish transportation would have been handled by local logistical firms. Exporters could have added a Gabon product stamp on expensive goods going to the Middle East or Asia. Processing fish here rather than they would have spurred other companies and produced thousands of jobs. Rather, Gabon received the most unsavory treatment. An annual check with no questions asked. But there were other repercussions besides financial loss. Without local industry, there would be no local data or insight into what was being stolen. Stock-level research is not financed by any scientific research centers. Lack of a feedback loop to inform decision-makers about the decline of Gabon's fisheries, changes in migration patterns, or marginalization of indigenous fishermen. Another, more serious issue was brought about by this gap. Gabon started depending on the EU to tell it what it was entitled to. Neither satellite surveillance nor Gabonese marine biologists provided the data that shaped policy. The operators were the source. The fishing fleets were essentially self-auditing the facts and self-reporting their catch. It was at this point that Nguema's annoyance took root. How can a country make plans for the future based on resources it cannot track, process, or actually see? This goes beyond fish in the grand scheme of things. It has to do with blindness in the country. Not only does a nation lose money when its raw materials are not processed, it becomes ignorant. Furthermore, a nation cannot negotiate from strength if it is unaware of its wealth. A large portion of post-colonial Africa has been afflicted by the extract, export, forget approach. The narrative has been the same for cashews in Côte d'Ivoire and cobalt in the Congo. With every shipment, refined items return, raw goods depart, and the profit margin widens. One of the few remaining frontiers in Gabon where a new model could have been tested was the marine industry. However, there was stagnation rather than experimentation. The EU deployed its armada, paid its price, and won the award year after year. Coastal villages did not remain silent for years, but Gabon did. Local fishermen expressed dissatisfaction at the difficulty of navigating their traditional fishing sites. It was now more difficult to locate species that had inhabited nearshore waters. Climate change was cited by some. Others pointed the finger at industrial fishing vessels that operate just out of sight due to their amazing efficiency. In any case, the seas were becoming more and more silent, and not merely in a symbolic sense. Then there was the cost to future generations. An entire blue economy was put on standby in a nation where youth unemployment is a ticking time bomb. Instead of becoming marine technicians, port managers, biologists, or cold chain specialists, young people were either forced into informal labor or removed from the workforce completely. The youth stayed, the fish went, and there was no link between them. Then, Nguema's choice had more to do with sovereignty. It had to do with realizing the extent of what had been lost. Not just cash, not just fish, but the chance to create a system and a self-sufficient future. The question facing Gabon now that the agreement is done is not what was taken. It's what's still attainable. There were no dramatic ultimatums or ferocious speeches when Gabon announced it was pulling out of the EU fishing deal. There were no diplomatic walkouts or leaking memos. We're done with a straightforward sovereign declaration. That choice was deafeningly silent. And that was a great surprise to Europe. Gabon had long been seen as a reliable partner by Brussels. Not extreme, not rebellious. A peaceful, resource-rich nation that valued compromise above conflict. In discussions for years, Gabonese officials would nod cautiously while European leaders discussed shared growth, sustainability, and collaboration. With little fuss, the deal had been renewed multiple times. On paper, it appeared to be a model partnership that they could use as evidence that Europe's presence in Africa was advantageous and balanced in papers, studies, and speeches. However, that delusion vanished in an instant. EU officials reacted with surprise when the announcement was made. Although they had not anticipated it, they accepted Gabon's legal right to withdraw. There was simply the fact that one of Europe's oldest African fishing partners had abruptly and unrepentantly left without any prior notice, renegotiation, or manufactured diplomacy. There was more to that surprise than that. Fear, because it wasn't just fish that were lost when Gabon left. It was a breach in a meticulously preserved facade. What did it indicate for other African nations with comparable agreements if Gabon, which was before seen as reliable and cooperative, could turn down a contract that Europe had characterized as mutually beneficial? Would this set off a chain reaction? Brussels trembled at the prospect. With nations like Senegal, Mauritania, Guinea-Bissau, and Ivory Coast, the EU has inked hundreds of fisheries partnership agreements, or FPAs, along the West African coast. The EU's seafood supply chain is heavily reliant on these accords, especially for tuna. which is sold in supermarkets in France, Spain, and Italy. Fish captured in African waters should be landed, processed, and sold in Africa if Gabon's reasoning were to become widely accepted. The EU's fishing approach in the area may lose its economic underpinnings. Europe wasn't afraid about Gabon's ability to process seafood. It had to do with Gabon's guts and the precedent it sets. Immediately, some European commentators attempted to portray Gabon's choice as illogical, possibly with political motivations. Some argued that Nguema was utilizing nationalism as a diversion from internal problems and was posing for domestic approval. But such justifications were insufficient. It was more difficult to accept reality. Gabon just outgrew the arrangement after learning from the experience of 18 years in a quiet deal. Additionally, EU leaders were aware that Gabon's move coincided with a decline in their influence in Africa. European dominance on the continent is rapidly coming to an end. A new generation of leaders is rising throughout Africa, one that is more concerned with strategic autonomy and value retention than with legacy institutions. Gabon's departure was not a revolt in that environment. There are allies for the alliance that it was. The fairness of EU fishing agreements has been openly questioned by nations like Senegal and Mauritania. Senegalese local fishermen have protested against European trawlers, claiming that they are destroying fish stocks and leaving little for local markets. For years, activists from all over the continent have cautioned that these accords squander Africa's maritime treasure, while cloak the process in diplomatic jargon. They now have a blueprint from Gabon. Even nations that aren't currently renegotiating agreements are paying attention. Gabon demonstrated that anarchy is not necessary in order to leave. Sanctions or war are not necessary. Clarity and the courage to admit that this is no longer effective for us are all that are needed. For the EU, this is a business issue as well as a foreign policy one. European businesses who rely on Gabonese tuna will now have to find other suppliers or pay more. The concept that the EU could continue to have long-term access to African natural resources using outdated models is now seriously threatened. And the logistical pipelines from the sea to European ports are also under disruption. Although the tone has shifted, Brussels has responded that it is still open to discussion and future collaborations. Mutual respect is discussed more than automatic renewals. This isn't diplomacy as usual, it's damage control. Europe knows deep down that the tides are shifting. The Gabon it once viewed as compliant, passive, and predictable has vanished. In its place stands a nation that now speaks through bold actions, not quiet negotiations. After years of being overlooked, Gabon is making itself heard. And across the continent, Africa is paying attention. Do you think other nations will follow this path? If they do, how will that reshape Africa's future? Are we witnessing the beginning of real change? Tell us what you think in the comments section below. And please do not forget to like and subscribe for more.